Hello, everyone. My name is Anshuman. My pronouns are they and them, and I am the junior graphic designer at Agents of Ishq. I am also your MC for this session. And before we start the session, we have a very, very exciting hour planned for you. So please make sure you're seated comfortably, and please make sure that your dil and your dimag both are ready to be titillated by our absolutely amazing superstar panelists that we have with here today. Before we start, I'd like to mention that this panel is available in Indian Sign Language, as you can see on screen. It's also being translated into Hindi and Tamil. So let me just start by introducing the panel a little bit, very, very briefly. It's called Hum Bane Tum Bane Data Ek Duje Ke Liye, Communities DIY Data. And we are going to be talking about how communities that can't find data about themselves, how they go about finding the data and creating the data on their own. For example, certain communities like trans people, Dalit people have always been sidelined when it comes to data and research. Marginalized communities are often misrepresented or not even represented at all, especially in data that deals with their own lives. So in such a landscape, how do these communities come together and advocate for themselves? How do they come together not just to find data, but also to take ownership of that data and to create their own data? Well, we're very, very lucky to have such talented, incredible, brilliant, show-stopping, and all-around superstar panelists on the panel with here today. Let me start by introducing them. We have Anish Gawande, who is a writer, translator, and academic. He's the curator and founder of Pink List India, which is a very, very Zabardast project that documents Indian politicians who have spoken about and advocated for LGBTQ plus rights. He holds a degree in comparative literature and society from Columbia University and is currently a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University doing his master's in public policy. Next up, we have Brenda Lakshmi, who is an activist, intersectional queer feminist researcher and advocacy professional. Their work is informed by their experiences as a queer activist, and they have authored the study Gendering of Development Data in India, Beyond the Binary, for the Center for Internet and Society for the Big Data for Development Network. Jyotsna Siddharth is an actor, artist, activist, and writer. She is India lead for Gender at Work. They have co-founded several social art projects, including Project Anti-Caste Love, as many of you all know. Project Anti-Caste Love is a project that documents how caste intersects with intimate relationships. Jyotsna has also founded the Dalit Feminist Archive. It is a resource on the knowledge, achievements, and progress of Dalit people. She has a master's in development studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and they have also a master's in social anthropology from School of Oriental and African Studies in London. Moderating our panel today is Satyendra Kumar. He is a human rights activist, and he co-founded the Center for Social Equity and Inclusion. He is also the person behind the National Youth Equity Forum, which is a collective of Dalit, Adivasi, Muslim, and nomadic tribes, young leaders, and young people who advocate for the social, economic, cultural rights of marginalized children. He has finished his studies from Tata Institute of Social Sciences and also from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'd like to mention that this panel will be followed by a question and answer session. So you can all drop all of your sexy sawal in the Q&A box below. Before we start, I'd also want to request everyone to be as open-hearted, kind, generous, and above all, respectful as possible. Remember that this is a safe space, and we want to make sure that it is as pleasurable and enjoyable and safe for everyone involved. We also have resources and mental health professionals that if you want to reach out to them, you can find their details in the chat below. And yes, over to you, Satyendra.
Yes, thanks, Anshuman. First of all, greetings, सबको नमस्ते, सतरंगी सलाम, जिंदाबाद आज के दिन के लिए. और आज I'm sorry, I will just switch on to English as a main language to everybody. So sorry. So greetings to all, and all of I welcome all the panelists and to all the organizers of LSD. We are really excited to have this interesting discussion of the day. What is that we are going to talk about today? Data, communities and data. This is something which we have been trying and dealing with in our day-to-day life. Every day in every of our work, we look for data, and everybody and every agencies look for some or other kind of data to find what they are going to do about with those data, with those people, with those humans. Data mining again is a becoming a big industry, and everybody is trying to find data. But coming from the marginalized community and from working with Dalit community for past 15 years, what I have realized and what I want to explore today and understand it, that what are the kind of data we are looking for, and how the data is being collected. Whether we are doing research or we are getting researched upon. The Dalit community, which is a marginalized community, Adivasi community, which is also geographically isolated and marginalized, LGBTQ community, the people try to find out about us, and for many years, to prove that we are marginalized. Again, that means a Dalit community who is a poor and a marginalized community, knowing about self that I'm a poor and marginalized, you do a research for 2 years and 3 years, and ultimately to prove that the Dalits are marginalized or Dalits are poor. Is this way of research is going to help that community? Is this way of identifying about people, about life, human lives, and then proving that they are worthless, or they're nothing positive about it, or there is nothing to celebrate, there is nothing to identify, and ultimately proving that the marginalization frame is the frame which is again going to be pushed upon the communities when we go to work with them. So is this the way to do the data, look for data? Or is there a positive way of looking data? Can data change the life of people? Can data prove a positivity into the human personalities when you relate with them, when you identify with them, when you talk to them, when you meet them, when you spend time with a young person or the communities of marginalized sections? Do you really identify those threads, those personality, those intimacy, those aspects which are never spoken about? When you meet a young person or when you meet a community, there are many other things which the community holds, which the community has to speak about: their relationship, their life, their orientation, their negotiation spaces which they are dealing every day, and their entire looking at the change model. What kind of change they are looking for? What kind of challenges which they are wanting the data collector to address or the people to address it? Can we look into those kind of things? Can we start looking at data or talking about people? And I don't call it like when you go to the young people and try to identify, collect some data. It's not data. You actually go to understand the person. You go to understand the person, the different aspects of the person, and try to create a change model, or try to bring that data to make sense of that life of that person. And how do you make sense of that sense of the life? And so connecting to this entire idea of communities and data collection, today we'll hear about that how this entire process of researching, finding data have been seen from different perspectives by our eminent panelists. And you'll also see how we want the data collection to be framed upon, to be taken forward. by all of us when we deal with communities and their lives, and particularly in the context of marginalized communities in India. And when I say marginalized community, we are talking about all those marginalized communities which are excluded based on their identity, be it Dalit, be it tribal, be it Muslim, be it nomadic tribe, LGBTQI community, and this consists of half of India's. So today we are going to talk about how half of India's wants the entire data collection or entire research, or how do we want to see this entire collection of stories from the communities and creating change model from that stories, how it should look like. So here it is, and I'll be happy to invite all our panelists, and we'll start with Anish, and we'll hear after that Brinda and Jyotsna is here. So I request Anish to come in and uh, share about everything around communities and data. हम बने तुम बने data एक दूजे के लिए. How do you see this?
Thank you so much, Satyendra ji. It's actually such a pleasure to be here today with people whose work has inspired me for so long, familiar faces, and then new people whose work I've had the chance to look over in the past few days. My name is Anish Gawande. I am from Mumbai. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the co-founder of Pink List India. I'll give you a little bit of an idea about Pink List India, how we started off. And I think tracing the journey to show you exactly every single step of the way where we went wrong, to sort of shed light on the ways in which data can be incredibly dangerous and why ethics and data are so important. So today as it stands, right, Pink List India is an organization that works primarily on advocacy and awareness. Our main project is State of the Union, which is found at pinklistindia.com/pinksabha. And the project is aimed at cataloging every single statement made on LGBTQ plus rights by every single Lok Sabha MP. So the good, the bad, and the ugly, as a means of having accountability and as a means for queer people across the country to know who their allies are in Parliament. Now, this project actually started off many, many years ago when I was still an undergraduate student through a grant that I got from Columbia University's Center for Global Projects. At that time, like all undergraduates, I was very excited by sexy names. So I had a name called Against 377. And this was supposed to be a project that collated all sorts of cultural resistance to 377. This was 2017, so 377 was still on the statute books. That court case was still going on. And everyone was trying to find unique ways to make the Supreme Court change its mind, right? So I was sitting and thinking, let us show the Supreme Court how there are so many people across the country who are resisting 377 in their own way, right? And the idea was a very cheesy one, where 377 on one side and the number of creative things created against 377 on the other side to show the difference in scale. Now, this was going to be done on an interactive map because I had just learned some GIS skills at the time. And I thought that we will get some points where every single contribution, be it a poster, be it a song, be it a sort of pride parade, be it a sort of, a flash mob, could be represented on this map, and it could show you the entire map to show you just how many people are resisting, and to dispel this myth that LGBTQ plus rights only happen in the cities, or fighting for LGBTQ plus rights only happens in the cities. Right? There was an experimental methods research group that was happening at the university at the same time, which was a sort of hub for all these data projects to come together. And I very naively, as a 20-odd-year-old, went there and said, this is a great project. I've gotten funding for it. I can build this incredible project. It's going to look beautiful. And somebody sat me down and said that you do realize that in a country of 1.2 billion people, you're creating a map that will allow everyone to pinpoint exactly where the LGBT people are, right? And this is something that I hadn't even considered, because data is such a wonderful thing that we see it everywhere, particularly if I am a humanities student, I don't deal with data. So the only time I see data is with eyes of excitement because I don't understand much of it. And so there's this eagerness to create something new that will allow data to be used in a productive way, but you don't really question the ethics of that data very often. So what ended up happening with that project actually was it never went ahead. After a lot of brainstorming, it was clear that it could not be an ethical project. And I think the first lesson that I learned in engaging with data is just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. And I think that's a principle that's been incredibly useful in the years that have followed, because, right now, recognition is easy. In an age of Instagram validation, getting someone to appreciate your project is easy, but truly remaining ethical is really difficult. And you have to question yourself, because there's enough people who will say that you're doing rubbish work. There are enough people who are saying you'll do good work, and you have to have that ethical mooring yourself, because we don't really have community accountability in this age of fragmentation, right? So all of this happened, and I had given up that project, and I had turned to Senegalese linguistic politics as an academic, and was very far away from queerness in India, and had sort of become disheartened. And after graduation, I got the opportunity to come back to India and work on an election campaign. Now, this is I had a degree in comparative literature. I didn't know what I was going to do, but I always knew that if I wasn't doing anything for that election, I would be beating myself up about it and not stopping watching NDTV. So after graduation, for a year, I worked on the 2019 national elections. I was traveling across Maharashtra. And what was unique was I'd done a little bit of this before, but this was for the first time as an out gay man, right? And again, I come with many other privileges. I'm upper caste, upper class, which means that I come with certain forms of visibility that allow me to exist in this space in a very different way than other queer communities. But to me, it was a revelation as someone growing up who had always thought that it would be impossible to be queer and in politics, that there really was a space for me to exist here as well. And going around at that time, I realized that actually there was a lot more political will in support of LGBTQ plus rights as well, right? One of the most memorable things that was told to me was this journalist who told me that, she'd met Raju Shetty, who's a farmers leader from Hatakrangai in Maharashtra, who said to her once very casually that, I'm a farmers' rights leader, so of course I support LGBTQ plus rights. Otherwise, it would be hypocritical. And for many people within the political space, this was something that also came very naturally. And there was a need to look beyond your sort of English educated urban MPs and politicians to fight for LGBTQ plus rights, because at the end of the day, you had to get numbers, one, and two, you had to ensure that this impact made its way into various parts of the country. So over the course of that time, I started the organization Pink List India with Smriti Devra, one of my co-founders, and Devina. And one of the things that we did was we started cataloging all the politicians who were candidates for the Lok Sabha election who had supported LGBTQ plus rights, right? And the idea there was you have a carrot and stick initiative. You have given the stick to all the MPs who've spoken against LGBTQ plus rights. We know all of their names. We know all of the vile, vicious, homophobic, transphobic things they've said. What would happen if we gave some incentive, some recognition to the MPs who had actually supported LGBTQ plus rights, right? And so with that, we started collating all the candidates who had made statements on LGBTQ plus rights, again, in the public domain. So we wanted this to be something that they did on their own. We did not want to go up to somebody and ask them, what is your view on LGBTQ plus rights? Because that you will do automatically. Politicians are great liars. Then the minute a mic is in front of them and they know they have a good audience, they will say exactly what you want to hear. So we said anything in the public domain that you have said independently will be catalogued over here. Right. Again, lots of critique came our way, right? And I think very, very valid critique, particularly at a moment of right-wing nationalism. The biggest question that came our way was, there are many MPs who support LGBTQ plus rights, but are Islamophobic, casteist, even transphobic. And what do you do with that? Can you support them, right? So how do you, and as a upper caste queer person in the country, I had not thought through these frameworks of intersectionality, right? That what do you do in such a situation and how do you balance that out? And how do you sort of prevent this from becoming a project that's used for pink washing that's used for homonationalism, that's used for all of these purposes, right? So what we ended up doing eventually after after 4 years of that initial project of Against 377 is creating a map by flipping the power dynamic. What we said is after the elections were done and the MPs were elected, we've created a map today that shows you every single Lok Sabha MP in the country and every single thing that they have said on LGBTQ plus rights. Good, bad, and the ugly. So what this means is that it becomes an accountability mechanism wherein every single statement they've made is put up transparently. We're not giving any judgment call on these people. We're not saying they're doing well by speaking up for LGBTQ plus rights. What we're saying is we put all this data in the public domain to hold MPs accountable on issues that they're usually never held accountable to. So for instance, if there is an MP in Maharashtra, and I don't take names now, who has said that we will set up a transgender welfare board 3 years ago, then that statement is recorded on the Pink List India website on the Pink Sabha page, which means that every next time this person tries to come and say that they're LGBTQ plus friendly, we get the ability to hold them accountable, right? And this is an open access resource. So if you are listening in and the next time your MP is speaking at a public event or they're speaking anywhere that you are seeing them, this is your chance to sort of see their past track record and to also ask them questions about it and hold them accountable, because these are simply questions that they're not getting asked right now. So I think over the course of this journey, again, right, this has been a journey of many failures, many sort of setbacks, and many learning lessons. What we're doing now is, who are we tracking? Those in positions of power. Right. And I think this is incredibly important. Satyendra ji, you mentioned this as well. Which communities are being data harvested or data mined, right? And how do we, especially as people from marginalized backgrounds, turn the camera around and say, how do we study those in positions of power and use data to hold them accountable? The second thing is, why are we tracking, right? This is for accountability. And this again goes to your point that the ways in which data is used very often now is to say, acha chalo, there are so many LGBT people in India. Okay, there are so many LGBT people in India, but what do you do with that data, right? It's not helping anybody unless you're using that towards some end. So how do you use data in a way that has a set purpose that actually benefits the communities that come in contact with it? I'll give a very short example because I know I'm also running out of time. But one of the things that happened after we created this project was we had a trans woman from Hyderabad who was in a government job that had been given to her after the passing away of her father, who wanted to transition, right? Now, she was entitled to 2 years of unpaid leave from this government job, but it had to be approved by a series of supervisors. And often what happened in this department was that this had to have someone giving a reference or putting pressure on your boss to give you that leave, right? Now, she was not out of the closet and she could not sort of say openly that she wanted to take this leave to transition, which again, after the sort of Nalsa judgment, arguably in India would have been a valid reason to take time off from a government job and could have been something that could be challenged, but didn't want to come out, right? So reached out to us and we managed to find out that her local MP, who was actually an AIMIM MP, her local MLA was an AIMIM MLA. We reached out to the AIMIM MP from Maharashtra who had actually spoken out in support of LGBTQ plus rights and got him to speak to the one in Hyderabad to sort of see in any way if there could be pressure applied. And that actually resulted in things getting done. You know, and this is in many ways exemplary of the idea that today, in a space of political accountability, those from marginalized backgrounds don't know who their allies are and you don't know who you can reach out to. So how can data be used in a way to create structures that enable those without access to information, which is a very closely guarded secret, particularly in politics, give them access to that information and allow them to use it towards their own good. And finally, the last question is, what are we tracking? And this is, again, going back to the ethics of this, is everything, right? The good, bad, and the ugly, because today we are living at a time of increasing homonationalism and pinkwashing. I've just finished up one of my thesis on pinkwashing in Kashmir and how the Indian government has actually used the rhetoric of LGBTQ plus rights to justify the abrogation of Article 370 in ways that are incredibly troubling and should be concerning to all of us who fight for marginalized rights. Because there is a direct attack and a direct way in which ideas of marginalized communities and identities of marginalized communities are being used to justify oppression. And if we don't track the ways in which this is happening right now and see the ways in which identity is being manipulated towards very, very dark ends, I think it's going to be a difficult few years in the years to come. So I think ethical data is something that is going to be incredibly challenging as we move ahead. And understanding that ethical data comes with a lot of responsibility is something that all of us need to learn. And I think it's a journey that I have been on that I have found particularly sort of fruitful. And it's one that I've been very grateful to have mentors for, people who've critiqued me for. And as a last closing point, I'd like to say, and I can't speak for everyone on the panel, but at least for me, for anyone watching, if there's any project that you're involved with, where you have this lingering doubt, a gut feeling, an idea that this doesn't seem right, please reach out. And honestly, there's so many people willing to talk to you, willing to reason this through, but always come in knowing that sometimes the answer might be that there simply is no ethical way to do it. And just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do it. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Anish. It was very enlightening. And as you said very clearly that in today's context and in coming years, identities are manipulated to actually serve very bad practices, or whatever you call it, like inhuman practices, or just for certain gains through the data. I think it's very important also that that we need to turn the camera on the other side, flip the camera and say that, are you accountable? What kind of accountability you hold in respect to marginalized community, their identities, their lives, and what are those accountability where you need to just understand. I think there's very interesting aspects of ethical questions you are raising, and I'm sure this put a lot of questions and a lot of thinking around the mind of many people. Let's hear out Brenda and connect what you are trying to say also. So Brenda, welcome.
Hi, I'm Brenda. My pronouns are they and them. I am going to be looking at this DIYing data from a slightly different perspective of exploring or looking at the idea of DIYing data by marginalized communities, right? How much of power and privilege, or like basically power, they even have in doing that. So I'm going to be looking at a combination of things and sharing an array of things with respect to intimacy, gender and sexual minorities, and data from my work as a researcher, queer rights activist, and peer supporter working with the LGBTIQA+ community. Now, I'm going to set some context first. I'd like to begin by putting forth a lot of these questions that speakers before me have already asked as well, but I'm going to repeat. Does having a lot of data mean it is a good thing? Is it actually good to have a lot of data? How do we discern between situations that require data and don't require data? When we say we want to look at communities, especially minorities DIYing data, their data, is there a cost? Since we are speaking about gender and sexual minorities here, how does privilege and power play a role in this? And just to be clear, when I say data, I mean digital data, because that's the kind of data that I study, work with, even like converting offline data into digitized data, etc. Some of the things. So first things first, let's make one thing very clear. Anything digital is inherently a matter of privilege. The fact all of us are even here right now in this conference is also one such privilege. one needs to, for anything digital, one needs to have access to internet, a mobile phone, and more now a smart device, right? A smartphone, a laptop, some smart device. And there is a huge access gap with respect to this in the country. Most sections of the people don't have access to this or struggle to get access to internet or these devices. And in spite of this access gap, government's usual excuse for digitizing welfare, and I say this independent of the political party in power, digitizing welfare or collecting any data is in the name of inclusion of the marginalized, right? And I think Satyendra already just asked that question about, you want to get, you know that these people are marginalized and you want more data to prove that they're just marginalized. So for me, the question then becomes how much data is sufficient data about a community for you to know that they're marginalized, right? And due to historical marginalization, welfare is state-sanctioned welfare is extremely crucial for marginalized population groups like transgender community, Dalit, Adivasi communities. So the understanding because of the dependency on welfare, the understanding about government's demand for data often tends to be, the government is asking for my data, usually using a government issued ID. So I will give it because my life is dependent on this welfare. I don't really have a choice. So if I hand this data over, let's say using my ID document, I'm supposed to get this welfare. Does this mean that I will actually get my state-sanctioned welfare? No, it does not guarantee that either. We're supposed to get it, but many don't get it. Governance in our country is heavily influenced by cinema. It's like that long-running family drama mega serial, except that it is not real life, right? Government cannot simply use on-screen like heated, passionate dialogues in place of real action. It has real-life consequences for people, right? Especially for the marginalized. So with this as the backdrop then, what can we, how do we understand intimacy, rights of gender and sexual minorities and data? To me, I just decided to, I think many might agree, to work on the rights of gender and sexual minority. It's like, I see intimacy and the rights of gender and sexual minorities like as the protagonist of the longest running love story in history, and data is the villain. We still don't know if they'll ever get together, right? Decriminalization or not. Why is data the villain? Because data is usually the excuse for the lack of acknowledgement of gender and sexual minorities in the country. But then acknowledging the data would also mean that they're acknowledging the existence of supposedly some form of perversion. Okay? To me, it feels more perverse to limit a person's identity just to their gender or sexuality. And how we see in many films that the older brother is the villain, the patriarchal big brother, and we know from real life and movies that big brother is always watching the younger sibling, exactly like our government says, they're watching our back, right? However, we need to understand that the relationship between the state and the citizen is based on the constitution. We have constitutionally sanctioned rights that the state is supposed to ensure that we get. However, history shows that gender and sexual minorities have not had access to equal rights as other cisgender heterosexual people in the country. And this worsens with other intersectionalities, marginalized identities, such as caste, religion, disability. Homosexuality was criminalized in India till 2018. That history of criminalization and medicalization has not ended. Even after the Supreme Court read down Section 377 in the Navdev Johar versus Union of India verdict, and even with the passing of the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act in 2019. The law supposedly protects rights of transgender persons. However, the law still demands a medical certificate to identify within binary genders of male and female. It's the state's way of telling you that a doctor or a therapist is more qualified to tell you who you are, which is essentially to say whether a doctor would be able to tell you whether you're making any sense identifying yourself as a man if you're assigned a female at birth. Like, how can someone assigned female identify as a man? And as a woman to someone who is assigned male at birth, right? So in the name of protection, that's what the law says, Protection of Rights Act. The state has only placed more hurdles for transgender persons to change their ID documents and even enter these data systems, right? So to access welfare, transgender persons need to have valid ID documents in their preferred name and self-identified gender. And not all doctors and therapists are trans or queer friendly. So a whole group of people don't become part of the system because it seems like the system supposedly doesn't want them. Anyway, let's say there are some people, the person struggles, gets this certificate, changes their documents, and enters these digital data systems to access their rights. Then what? Do they actually get access to their rights? Some do, but not all. But data becomes about the some who have had access to their rights, right? Those numbers are often pushed forth by the government as we have achieved this target, like so many people have reached so many things and got so many things, more than the people who have been excluded in a particular state or even in the entire country. Of course, the other method is official enumeration in terms of checking for data. And for the first time, transgender persons were again supposedly included in the census of 2011. I say supposedly because there were several discrepancies with this. The enumerators did not understand who is actually included in the others category. There was conflation in the understanding between transgender and intersex identities. Basically, eventually there was undercounting of transgender persons in the country. When this data was used to design a welfare for transgender community, my study shows that some states like Meghalaya simply said, we don't have transgender persons in our state, so we don't need to have a policy addressing them. The data that is supposed to be big is not big enough for transgender people to matter, and then that causes erasure in that sense, right? Again, number seems to decide the need for policy, but how will a stigmatized population group come out about their identity just for the government to frame a policy? There have been several instances, I think, like the one that Anish mentioned now as well, right? Several instances of transgender persons facing harassment in government offices when they go to actually access what is rightfully theirs. Policies need to be based on our rights, not numbers, especially for a marginalized population group who are already marginalized, because the latent homophobia and transphobia still continues in the country. It doesn't matter that homosexuality has been decriminalized. Yes, it matters, but in real life, how it translates matters so much more. The community is too often too busy fighting for their existence to be acknowledged. The gradual legal and policy change will not help without a social reform, because people who have been and are still biased are the ones framing these laws or policies and also designing these technology systems. So they define these digital systems with the same biases to ensure that all these minority communities don't enter these systems, right? Including gender and sexual minorities. And so far I've spoken about gender and sexual minorities, their rights, data. What about the aspect of intimacy? Independent of sexuality, anyone who's been in a relationship in India, most if not all, this might be a familiar scenario for you, right? At some point, we've all been scared of, someone at home finding out we have a lover, partner, girlfriend, boyfriend. I'm not gendering. You do that for yourself. So after a point, it almost becomes like a paranoia in public. Like oh my God, don't hold my hand, don't come close to me. Someone may be watching. You got careful all the time, but then that one time, right, you actually get caught. And it might not even be someone from our family. You know how your big brother, your older brothers, colleagues, neighbors, son would have seen you this one time and remembers you. And now he's seen you on a bike with a guy. And then when you enter your home, there will be this one whole round of questions fired at you, especially if you were socially raised as a girl or woman, independent of how you self-identify your gender. Same thing happens often even for those who are assigned male at birth. So now your brother, his colleague, the colleague's neighbor, the neighbor's son, all of them know about that guy who you went out with. Now, if you're also identifying yourself as queer, with or without a partner or a lover, right? There's that constant anxiety inside of us, which you're very familiar with. Okay. We think that someone already knows. It's not they might know. They probably already knows by the way you walk, talk, or dress, or just about by anything. Unfortunately, this often also turns out to be true for a lot of queer and trans people, and they end up facing a lot of bullying, abuse, harassment while growing up. Now we think we are safe from this when we are online and nobody is watching us. However, it is not different. That neighbor's son who ratted you out to your brother, that's exactly what is happening right now when we are using online platforms, both by government or public sector websites and private sector companies. Here's a scenario, right? Let's say a trans person, this is just a scenario, but let's just say a trans person wants to buy a condom or an adult toy for their partner on a website. So where are you buying your condom from? Whose address are you sending it to? Did you look for HIV or STI testing services or book an appointment on an app? Just like that neighbor's son, the app, the payment gateway, the bank, and the whole load of others now know what brand of condom that you bought and who you are sending it to. Mind you, in one way or another, your ID is linked. When we are making a payment, our bank already knows what our ID document is and what our gender is, right? So suppose it's a trans person, based on the mismatch between your user account name, your bank details, and probably the STI services that you look for, we don't know what else is there. There's just like whole range of categories, right? We don't know. There's no transparency. They know that you're probably transgender, right? And it is your lover that you sent it to. Now they also know your lover's address and what brand of condom that they prefer. This is not just on e-commerce platforms. This happens on government websites in more obvious ways. There have been instances of this kind of data being published publicly on government websites in the name of transparency without your consent. However, it seems that we actually give our consent to the government and all these private companies. Supposedly we do when we actually give our data. But did we consent for our really personal, intimate data to go public? Is that what we gave consent for? Is this what I struggle so much for, to get that ID in my preferred name and my self-identified gender? So even for those who manage to enter the system after a lot of hurdle, there is no guarantee of accessing the service or privacy. There's often the argument of privacy is not a thing in India. Privacy is definitely a thing. Consent is not a thing in our country. So the state, at least with respect to the state, so the state believes that we don't understand privacy because they don't understand consent, even after the Supreme Court recognized it as a fundamental right. Remember the thing I mentioned, asked about how does privilege and power play a role in data? That's also why I called data the villain. Because it's about who's telling this data or who has this data, who is telling this data story, right? Many would say in case of health, many would say, we need data for health. Sure. Whose data? What's their identity? What's their marginalization? What's their power and privilege in the equation, even when you're talking about health? Is it the most marginalized who are actually getting access to that healthcare easily when you take all the data? So what's the data storyline? Who's telling the story? Whose story is being told? Gender and sexual minorities in the country are usually too busy trying to get their existence acknowledged. And often there's no room to invest time, honestly, many times, in DIYing data, right? When you're struggling to actually just survive. The community did this DIYing in a big way with respect to HIV. That's where it began. And that's how with a lot of, there also it was a lot of, when we say social reform, community work, community advocacy, engagement, and that paved the way, starting stone or stepping stone for, building towards, even the 377 or acknowledging the rights of trans people after a long fight. But it still feels like the state is comfortable with acknowledging the community only to a certain degree, as long as they don't make them look bad. Because data has now come to mean power, especially minority data, right? The more we are have data, we need to acknowledge them, we need to provide for them. And power means control, and the state doesn't want to give up its power or its control. Thanks.
Thank you, Brinda. I think very important points you have raised, like in this homophobic and transphobic society where we live in. What actually we need to do? Do we need to collect data, or do we need to prepare people to understand why to collect data, or why not to collect data also? So I think this is I think there are a lot of pre-work and a lot of other things needs to be done by the government, by society. Then only we can think of actually understanding the lives of marginalized people, and especially LGBTQ community and gender and sexual minority. I think that's something which very highlighting point from your side. Let's hear Jyotsna and also her experience with Project Anti-Caste and Anti-Caste Love, and with Dalit feminism. Jyotsna, welcome.
Thank you, Satyendra. I think I'm coming at a point where both Brenda and Anish have raised very critical points. So in a way, they've done my job really easy here. But I would like to begin by first just acknowledging that whatever I'm going to talk, if I'm mentioning women, I mean trans women. And so I will not be mentioning trans women separately. And I will also be kind of talking about some people's work as well, which I think falls into the intersections of everything that we are talking. So how do we understand intimacy in Indian society particularly, which is coded on a cultural social norms, right? I mean, first of all, to begin understanding intimacy in a country like India, where we haven't resolved the base foundation issue of caste system, is already a problem, which kind of, for me personally, as a Dalit queer woman, it already sets the foundation of everything that we are building, whether it's technology or data. It is kind of interacting with other sort of identities. And I mean, of course, there can be an ideological difference here, but I do find that there is a lot of obsession when it comes to collecting data, whether it's from the state, whether it's from people, whether it's from researchers and organizations who just want to collect data. So there is no clarity about what data they want to collect, for whom, what is the purpose, what should be the process of collecting data. And I think in the whole drive of collecting data, what we really forget is the process. It's in a way assumed that to collect data, you just need research skills. What you don't probably need is critical thinking, compassion, love, or feminist values that you should deploy while you're collecting data. Because as Anish also said, and Brinda said, that I think you also mentioned when you just opened the chat that it's not just about collecting data, but it's also about learning the human experience, needs, and rights of people. And I think that is the center of collecting data for me. There is an inherent power dynamic and equation when you collect data. So for a researcher who comes from a caste privilege or upper class backgrounds, it's easy for them to go collect data on any issue. But as a Dalit researcher, or as a Dalit woman or queer or trans person, if you were to collect data on any issue, particularly on caste and religious identities, it becomes difficult because in my own fieldwork experiences, and I'm sure some of you will also experience, is that there is a question of who are you? What is your last name? And then to disclose your identity of a Dalit person, it has a bearing on what data you can collect, whether you would even allow space to be interrogating or asking some of these questions. So, I mean, Akhil Kang's work I find really, really important here, because their PhD thesis is subverting this lens of going into the upper caste communities and families, where they're trying to understand the caste experience of upper caste families and their understanding of affirmative action. And I think this is an extremely important intervention as well as collecting data, because in a way it is assumed that the caste experience is something that only Dalit people have, and upper caste people have no caste experience, right? So this kind of PhD work that they are currently doing completely subverts, but also make the political data collection process political. So I think for me, the data collection process and research is inherently political. So there is no way to say that you can do this in a light touch way and it will not have any impact. On the other hand, then there is almost the process which is extremely extractive. So you're going to people to extract information. You forget that they're also people, and coming from, again, different marginal identities. So it's almost that data becomes important, but the people and experiences or the issues that you're trying to capture become not so important or even more precarious, because your fascination or desire to collect data is more important than the people you're collecting data from, and that needs to be questioned. So I think for me, as Anish said, ethics, consent, transparency, accountability, as also Brenda mentioned, and compliance are very, very important. So these are not things that that can be removed from how we even imagine data. So I think there is a lack of imagination of what kind of data we require in our context. And when it comes to marginalized communities, intimacy for me is not something that can be coded in form of data again when it comes to marginalized communities. And to extend this point to say that the realities experience of marginalized communities is not something that can perhaps be captured in the way that we imagine data today. So, I also want to talk about Bara Najlal's work. She's an artist who's been doing this incredible work where she's been recording stories of people, of trans people, of Muslim people, Muslim women, where people can go and record their, and it's in sort of open-ended recording where people can speak about their experiences. They also have this work which is called Bird Box that they have just installed in the communities, where people come and engage with we would have this kind of I don't know what you call it, but it's like a thing when you peep into it, and then there is a roll of film which goes on. So she's painted that and she leaves that in the community, so for people to come and engage. And then those conversations are also around sex and intimacy, and then you say like what kind of conversations are happening. So I find her work extremely powerful in also recording some of these experiences of marginalized communities, which may not find space in the way we collect data. So there's also to, in a way, to understand that there can be multiple ways of collecting data. This whole monolith idea of collecting data in form of numbers and showing it on the government websites or on form of organizations' website, sometimes our realities may not be captured like that, and we need to kind of be open to thinking of different forms of data. I think very important point that Anish mentioned is that when you come collect data, immediately there is a flip side to it, that you're making communities more precarious with, and there is that danger. So during Project Anti-Caste Love, early days when it started in 2018, I did a lot of interviews with intercaste, interreligious couples, individuals who were in intercaste, interreligious relationships. And those are the interviews I have not shared on the project yet. These are the stories I have not, put on Instagram, simply because I understood that while this is a rich data, it can also bring a kind of attention to the couples, especially in the political volatile country like India. And when you talk about intercaste and interreligious relationships, it already makes people precarious. So I didn't really put out that data. But then there are other projects that have come in who only sort of benefit and kind of put this reality of intercaste, interreligious relationships, where it means that the easiest way to build the narrative is to just share the stories. So I think there's also this kind of from the other side, I think people are also used to consuming a certain kind of data, and there is a reliance from people to accept a certain kind of data. So when people are trying to even diversify and capture complicated realities in different ways, people are also used to consuming data in a very linear sort of numerical way that can be easily understood. So I think there is that sense that I see both from people who make the data and for people who consume the data. And again, there are intersections of caste, gender, sexuality, and religion, disability, all of that. So, and also like in my work of Dalit Feminism Archive, when it started in 2019, we started sketching portraits of Dalit women, as part of building that archive. And I was faced with a severe backlash from the community who said that, how can you put someone's photograph, and these were like not original photographs, these are sketched photographs, how could you put these images on and call it an archive, while the archive was trying to anyway highlight the aspirations and achievements of women from Dalit community. There was a severe backlash because perhaps it started at the time where one of the other two projects were doing. But today, when I see that every other project on social media, especially on Instagram, who is sketching faces of people, whether it's Dalit people or it's trans people or queer people, and kind of gathering a lot of support and followers just on the basis of sketching people, it's something is interesting to me because that is no longer considered a threat anymore, and that is no longer considered as a problem anymore. So when this backlash happened, it was a moment for me to reflect that whether I was being a Dalit woman, whether I still was a person to be creating this kind of archive. Even though some of the criticism I found not so valid and some of it was valid, I still took a pause to actually reflect what archiving means, and maybe to also, so this is some work that I've been trying to do, is to create guidelines on archiving, especially marginalized communities who are also falling at the intersections, at different intersections of caste, religion, gender, sexuality, and disabilities and all of that. So, so I think that for as I understand through my work, making sense of data and collecting data should probably emerge from a political imagination of what kind of data we want and what kind of data is required to do our work. Because I also feel that there is enough and more data already, but we say that there is a lack of data to also give an excuse to not do the work, to not, already use the data that is available. Because there will never be a point where we will have data for everything that we want. That is absolutely impossible. perhaps we don't even want to reach to a point where we are also creating data on everything, things that we might just want to experience and not record it as data. And I think that sometimes having data on also things like love and intimacy also creates a hierarchy in what kind of intimacy and love you can experience. And to end on another example of the love letter series that Project Antica's Love did, this was a series that started when the NRC CA protest was happening. And even though I had several failed attempts of issuing a call on collecting love letters and people not responding, there was a moment in 2019 when people started responding, and I had this incredible resource of love letters that people shared. And that was the time when NRCCA protest was ongoing, where people literally came out and shared their intimate experience of what it even feels like to have a partner who might be Muslim or Dalit, or a partner who come from other. Unfortunately, I was not able to receive any letter from a trans couple, but then there was one couple who identify themselves as trans, but not much. So this particular resource helped me and also other people to understand the experience of fascism that people are going through, and an insight into that intimate experience and how that is political in itself, which may not require data of how many intercaste couples are killed or how many interreligious couples are violated, but it still gave us an experience of collectively reading an intimate experience, and to also making sense of the fact that these are political issues that we are all battling with on different scales and intensity. There is a need to have guidelines, especially when it comes to representation of Dalit women and women of other marginalized identities. I think what we do, just to kind of end it here, what we do find missing is that there is a lot of data on the history of violence. What we don't have data on is the history of love and care and some of these intersections. And I think that is where we need to head.
Yes,
thank you so much.
Thank you, Jyotsna. Yeah, I think this is really interesting part of your sharing. And truly speaking, actually, a lot of things, I mean, I'm here like not as moderator, but more like I'm learning a lot of things from you and our panelists also. That actually, when you're talking about like the Dalit movement, like caste system or tribal community and all, this is something which we are yet to explore. I mean, I can say it from the Dalit movement side also. Like we work with Dalit human rights and we go to do a lot of data things and all those things, but we are still not able to make headway and find ways like how do we identify these data or these people. And we only roam around what Brinda was talking about, the welfare schemes and some numbers and some programs, and then we just go around that. We just miss out the basic human nature, the love, relationship, intimacy. How do we identify even? How do we talk about it even? So I think that's a very interesting area of consideration. I think I will be taking as a learning. And we have very many questions already came in, and I'm asking a lot of other participants, audience, to please ask your questions specific to speaker also, or any general question, we'll bring it. So I will now we'll open for the questions. So I'll just read out some of the questions which have come already on board. And I think Jyotsna, you have a lot of questions to things. If you can also type in, you were talking about the PhD thesis of somebody work, the writer's name. If you can just write that name in the chat box. I think somebody has written. You've already done it. Okay. The question which is coming to Jyotsna again, you have like, how do we, a lot of the time, Jyotsna, I'm just reading out and then other can also add into that. So a lot of the time data on marginalized communities, anecdotal, qualitative, especially when it's with regard to topics of love, sex, romance, pleasure. And these qualitative data on this topic is automatically dismissed by the mainstream. How do we tackle this? And how do we make sure the data is used to benefit the communities meaningfully?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult question, to be honest. I'm going to try to answer this, but I think just to also draw what Anish said, that, just because you can do something doesn't mean you have to. It is important to know what data you want to absolutely collect, and what is the need of what will that data achieve if you collect that data, what impact that data is going to have. I think these are two important questions you need to ask. And third is whether you're the right person or an agency or an organization to be collecting that data. Fourth, it is important to center accountability, ethics, and compassion in your data collection process, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, and to understand that some of this anecdotal qualitative data may not be collected, might not be possible to collect that kind of data, and that's okay. So thinking about other means of capturing some of these insights, whether it can be a form of recording, as Baranajlal's work I shared, or whether it can be in form of written material, or journals or something like that. So I think it requires some kind of out-of-box thinking to imagine how that data can be collected, rather than just going in the stereotypical way of survey and questionnaire and FGD, which can only do so much in my opinion.
I think someone has highlighted that also, that what about the idea of love letters and love stories as the method of data collection? So
why not?
collections, that's what you are referring.
But I think
also.
again, it's very, very important, because love letters are extremely personal. And why would anybody give that as a form of resource, or should give that as a form of resource? Because you need to have enough confidentiality in place. There has to be there has to be consent forms and all of those things. It is not just about collecting data, but you have to put in mechanisms that protects the identity of the people who are in a way opening up their life to you. And I think data collection has to be seen that way, and not just making people as targets, what state does. I mean, then we're not really different from the state.
I think that's very important, that sometime data collection also happens with an intention of targeting the community itself. So, or doing something wrong with the community also may happen. So I think very important to have the personal safety and safe methods of identifying data. But we have another questions also coming, very another aspect. I think other panelists can also talk about it. The data representing the rights and needs of differently able communities, not that enough. So what are all the measures that can be taken to get more data and representation of differently able community in the society? I think this also talks about like intersections, like there are a lot of intersectional data we need from different communities. How do we do that? What do you see, Anish, Brinda, and this really comment?
So for me, again, like I said, since I work with digital data, to begin with, these technologies are not built in an inclusive manner. It's like in their imagination, persons with disability don't exist. Like I said, it's people with biases are the ones building these systems. So there needs to be very conscious. There's a lot of effort in lot of disability rights activists have been fighting for this for many years, right? Especially with Aadhaar and all, to actually get an ID document has been difficult for a lot of persons with disability. So when we're and so this is also, it's not like people are not telling that there is a problem. So how is that data being recorded about saying that there is a problem? Are you actually acknowledging it when we are saying that there is a problem and you need to it's like even in the other case in the Supreme Court, all the, the discrimination, marginalization, exclusions that marginalized communities face because of their ID document was not entirely taken into consideration. In fact, welfare was used as the reason to say, let's mandate Aadhaar for that. Instead, the opposite. So are you listening? Are people even listening who are collecting data? Listening as well, right? So to engage with enumerators need to make more conscious efforts to actually go and listen to persons with disability. And there are so many categories of disability. It's not like we think that it is, we know like 4 or 5 and we think that's about it. There are persons with psychosocial disabilities also, they need to be taken into consideration. So there's a whole range there when we're talking about disabilities or persons with disability and rights of persons with disability as well.
Yeah, rightly. Anish, you have one question for Anish to explore. Did you manage to bring any accountability or shift among politicians, given that the larger vote bank continues to be regressive? So, how to shift the political focus from vote bank to rights?
I think it would be very, very presumptuous of me and very boastful of me to say we've brought in any accountability. I think any project like this is going to take decades to get any form of accountability, particularly within the Indian political system. I think what it has provided is a way for people to ask more nuanced questions. I think it's provided a platform through which people can build upon the knowledge of others and the questions others have asked in the past, to ask more difficult questions of politicians, which is often the only way of holding them accountable. And so I think, but I want to touch upon this other part of this question, right? Particularly because in the framework of queerness, we have been very used to seeing a fight for rights as being a request for rights. It's always been Supreme Court petition, High Court petition. The trans community is a valid example, which has been actively fighting for rights and sort of going and hitting the streets against regressive policy. The rest of the queer community, we've been used to petitions, right? Politics doesn't work on petitions. And I think that's a fundamental shift that needs to be understood within the queer community, where you cannot request rights. Rights have to be demanded. Right? Nobody is going to give you rights merely because you ask nicely. And that shift requires then an understanding that, and here, interestingly, data comes in handy, right? I think the Supreme Court, in all of its wisdom in 2013, called the LGBTQ plus community a minuscule minority, right? Now, what do we do with that? I don't doubt it. Now, I'm saying we are a minuscule minority. So what does that mean? I think that opens up the possibilities for political imagination, right? I'll give you only one example. At the CA NRC protests at Mumbai Bagh, there were a group of people who ended up after Mumbai Pride at Mumbai Bagh, right? We all dressed in our Pride outfits and we ended up at Mumbai Bagh. And this was the space where a lot of feminist movements, queer movements, movements against Islamophobia, and the movements for Dalit rights were all sort of coming together because, it was this sort of heady environment of optimism after a very long time of no hope. Right. And all of us were there. And it was one of those few moments where you realize that it's only through acts of solidarity that rights-based discourses can be successful. Right. So the movement for queer rights, if we understand it through a political lens, and I agree with the question, right? Politicians only care about vote banks. The movement for queer rights can only be successful if it ethically allies with anti-caste movements, with movements against Islamophobia and newer fronts, right? There was a very interesting protest that we did, which the Mumbai police was very confused by, bless them, against Bolsonaro, when Bolsonaro was speaking at the Republic Day as chief guest, right? And one of the things that I was very proud of creating, I think is the most useful thing I've done with a literature degree, is a slogan that said, "Are Amazon queer ladai, Modi Bolsonaro bhai bhai." And you know, you had a lot of RA protesters come in, a lot of environmental protesters come in with a lot of queer protesters. It really not met each other that much before, but there was this united under oppressors agenda that was happening that allowed you to understand that none of these causes independently are going to be able to have an impact, particularly sort of minorities like queer minorities. And the more we realize, and we're realizing this under this government as well, right, that the fight for rights can never be a request, but has to be a demand. The more we'll realize that allyship is what will get accountability measures to actually stick. And it's ethical allyship that will actually allow for any of these rights-based discourses to go forward, because otherwise it's impossible.
Yeah, that's true. Said very clearly. And I also agree to that, that until we build that allyship and actually demand for it, I don't think that there is other way to make the system accountable. And the system will become accountable because, as I said very clearly, also like just to sum up with some of the aspects also. Let's take one more aspects. If we can take like 30 seconds, each one of you to just say it's a question for all of us. Then I will sum up after that. We have only 5 minutes left for the entire session. So question is coming like, how can we engage with data and data representation in more creative ways through the arts, especially to bring the divide between large quantitative data and more engaged qualitative data? Are there any good examples of this? So just 30 seconds, all three of you, what your opinion on that?
I'll just quickly jump in.
Yeah.
I think that we've discussed a lot about the production of data. I think we need to reimagine how we present data, right? And I think what is incredible is that not all data needs to be digitally represented. Not all data that is created needs to be put online, because that means it cannot be limited in its access. So you also need to think about who wants to be seen and who should see the people who want to be seen.
Exactly.
An example I would recommend is this incredible thing, and if you have to really go to see it, is Parveena Ahangar's sort of association in Kashmir, the Association of Parents of Disappeared Persons, which has an incredible archive of all the people who've gone missing in Kashmir. And it's collected even today as newspaper clippings in these folders. And that data cannot be put on the internet, because you have to sit there and you have to realize, when you sit in a room with hundreds of files around you, the scale of the problem. Because when you put it on an internet website, it becomes like, acha, okay, there's one more thing, there's 300 names. We're so used to seeing Excel sheets with so many rows that we become desensitized. And sometimes the best way to represent data is to show the magnitude of that data and how real it is. And maybe that doesn't mean putting it on the internet.
Sure. Yeah.
I think I'll also quickly just come in. I mean, as I shared, Baran Ijlal's work, and Change Room Archives is this huge archive where she's been collecting voices, narratives of people for many, many years. And there are many people, even Padmini Remure, and a lot of people who are within the arts and I think the question of this doesn't lie just in arts. I think it lies at the intersection of arts with research and other disciplines, and there are people who are working on the intersections. I think the most fundamental question when it comes to data is that that for a lot of communities, especially Dalit communities, there has been a merit in not making themselves visible, because when you make yourself visible, there is an absolute violation and violence that is come on to you. So sometimes putting your data is also dependent upon the fact whether you want to make yourself visible or not, and how you want to make yourself visible. And I think this goes also very true for trans people, for people with disability, and people who are at the intersections at the current moment, Muslim community as well. So I think this is something that is really important, whether we're making ourselves visible or invisible, and we don't have to do that all the time. I think we can choose to be visible or invisible depending upon what is the context and project that is required. And I think that for me is important when it comes to data.
Yeah. Okay. So we have 2 minutes, 30 seconds. Brinda, you have.
I am taking a slightly different route for this. I think the qualitatively recording data through arts, I think we have to actually think about how are we preserving arts itself to begin with, because there are art forms that have been recording data and stories. Storytelling has been so inherently a part of our culture across the country, right? So now with all the pandemic and all of that, we're also talking about, are we allowing the erasure of so many art forms and so many storytelling forms also to take a hit? Artists have lost livelihoods and all of that. So we need to look at also how can we enable the art ecosystem firstly to actually be able to capture the data also. It's not just saying how can we, because now when we look at art, it is typically becoming just digital art or digitally telling a story. So there are like a whole group of people, so many art forms that are there that we need to probably take into consideration and look at engaging with them also. We need to rethink capturing data itself. Thanks.
Great. Thank you to all of you. We'll conclude in another 1 minute. So first of all, I would really like to thank all three of you, Anish, Brinda, Jyotsna. Such a brilliant 1.5 hours we had, where I think it can become a very nice reading things for people if you put it down in a book format or something like that. So very interesting and very informative to know different aspects of data and communities. I think I have one question for myself. I'll conclude with that also. The question for me is that how do we change the framing of the data collection so that it becomes affirming and positive lens, doesn't dehumanize the communities? I think that's very, very important. And I think we all need to keep in mind one very important thing, that data, when it comes to marginalization and going to the marginalized to find out anything about with the marginalized community, it is the marginalized community who holds the keys. So first of all, give the keys to the marginalized community, involve them to understand what they would like to collect from the community, and do not bring anybody else from outside and throw on them, like what I call it, like pushed other people to come to my home and to my life and say that, okay, please talk about your life. I'm not going to talk about it. So first thing is that involve marginalized community, involve the communities with whom you are going to do certain kind of work or build narratives around that, and make that community people aware about how to collect data, how to do that. That is skilling also has to go. So why I'm saying, because if you go to many of the Dalit community or a tribal community or a nomadic tribe community, they have many things to talk about. There are many things to say about it, but then they would not like to expose themselves to anybody unknown to them. And there's no skill available also among the communities with research kind of thing. So how do you build that community of researchers within marginalized communities who are very, who goes closer to the community and create that lens of positivity and understand, and which helps them to identify more data around love, sex, relationships, and many other things. So I think that's something is a key. And second part is that do not, I mean, I don't think that we should, like all of you are saying, that we should not collect data to just for the sake of collecting data. If it doesn't mean to people, if it doesn't make system accountable, if it doesn't help me to in any ways, the data doesn't make sense to me. So I think that's something which we are taking up with this with this 1.5 hours, and good learning for me as well. And I'm very thankful on behalf of all the audience and everybody. Thank you very, very much to all three of you for putting out such an interesting discussion today. So thank you very much. Once Jai Bhim, Zindabad, Satrangi Salam, Johar, all kind of greetings, so that we are able to one day come all build this alliance together and make our voices heard to many people outside and within ourselves also. Thank you very much.